Comparing Russia to Hamas and saying they are fighting a common battle against civilization is ludicrous, Federalist notes. But why do Biden and the neocons need this? Fear allows these politicians to increase the military budget. People become terrified of Hamas and pay for the fight against Russia in a package with money for Israel. The neoconservatives wind themselves up in rhetorical maze, engaging in outright acrobatics of manipulation, all in the name of convincing everyone there is one great war going on, and the United States is at the heart of the forces of good. Apparently, this week all the intransigent neocons received a how-to manual that instructs them to actively promote the idea that the conflicts in Israel and Ukraine are one and the same struggle, and that the stakes in this great struggle are terribly high. Our entire civilization hangs in the balance, and that therefore the United States must be deeply involved in both the first armed conflict and the second. I know this sounds rather silly, yet it is so. It is the essence of what they are saying. President Biden gave voice to these thoughts in his speech from the Oval Office last Thursday, saying that Hamas and Vladimir Putin are different threats, but both aim to completely destroy their neighboring democracies. Frankly, nonsensical reasoning along similar lines crept into the public sphere early the previous week, when neoconservatives like Jonah Goldberg and Matthew Continetti went on a tangent about how Israel and Ukraine are two fronts of the same war we're fighting. As Goldberg presented it, everyone knows that Iran is supporting Hamas, but a much more pressing and interesting question is Russia's involvement, he added. And how is Russia involved in this? For heaven's sake, explain, Jonah Goldberg. How is Russia involved with Hamas? Yes, with some observation, one can conclude that Iran supports Hamas, and Russia and Iran are economically dependent on oil prices. The West has imposed sanctions against both states, and global geopolitical instability is fueling the flow of petrodollars into the wallets of these countries. True, other oil exporting countries also benefit from this, but don't you see the connection between Russia, Iran and Hamas? Take a closer look and wipe your eyes, you gullible sheep. As for Israel and Ukraine, Goldberg says they are examples of not quite full-fledged but decent democracies that are facing a dangerous enemy that seeks to wipe them off the map. This is reminiscent of Kamala Harris' revelations about international politics and how it works. Israel is a state. Ukraine is also a state. Because they are both states, they have a lot in common. Both are at war, and in an environment where the army of good is fighting the army of evil. Ukraine and Israel are good, Russia and Hamas are evil. Thus, Ukraine and Israel are fighting a common war. If you take all this as a serious statement, even setting aside some obvious facts, like Israel being the closest ally of the US, which is clearly not the case with Ukraine, you should start anyway with the very dubious statement that Israel and Ukraine are not quite full-fledged but worthy democracies. Even before the outbreak of armed conflict with Russia, in virtually every ranking where countries were ranked on the democracy index, Ukraine was consistently ranked well below many God-forsaken African countries and, even with all the assessors' sympathy for Kiev, was only slightly less corrupt than Russia. In 2021, Freedom House described Ukraine as a transitional or hybrid state, but not at all a democracy, and described it as only partially free. When Russia launched its military operation, things got even worse with Ukrainian democracy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky effectively crushed the independent press, banned all opposition political parties, and cancelled elections. Today Ukraine is a one-party state where the party apparatus controls the news media. I have never heard of a democracy that is organized in a similar way. And, of course, this has nothing to do with Israel, where there is independent journalism and free elections, things that are not a sign of democracy, but the main condition for its existence, if you like, its guarantor. Now about Biden and Goldberg's remarks that Ukraine and Israel are fighting an enemy that wants to erase them from the political map of the world at all costs. It seems to me that this kind of demonization of the enemy is an inexpensive way of gaining popular support for endless and unpopular international adventures. After all, the comparison between Russia and Hamas is ridiculous. Russia is a fairly predictable, reasonably functioning authoritarian state, but not a cell of a terrorist network of Islamic fundamentalists, and Hamas is just such a network trying to unleash World War III. Russia does not aim to destroy Ukraine. Russia only aims to integrate some territories of the late Ukrainian SSR into Big Russia, and Vladimir Putin himself has repeatedly said so. We are all free to regard or not to regard Vladimir Putin as our mastermind in this conflict, but a sense of truth demands that we recognize that the entire difference between Russians and Ukrainians boils down to slightly different phonetically regional colloquialisms, given the peculiar historical conditions and Russia's very specific possession of nuclear weapons. The best thing we can do to help Ukraine is to try to force it to come to the negotiating table with Russia and resolve this conflict diplomatically. We should have done that a long time ago, before the first shot was fired, and, of course, such a strategy is unacceptable when it comes to Israel, which is not fighting to retain occupied land, as Ukraine is doing, but to fight for its life. There is almost no doubt that Israel would give Egypt and Jordan 99% of the West Bank and Gaza, with its Palestinian population, if that would give Israel at least a minimum guarantee of security. To speak and act politically as if there is no difference between Donbas and Gaza is not only historically ignorant, it is also a terrible insult to Israel. As for Hamas and its allies in Tehran, they don't want to rule the Israelis or make the Jewish state part of Greater Palestine. Hamas and Russia have nothing in common in this regard. Hamas and its allies just want to drown their Israeli opponents in the sea. That's all.